Unlocking queenside influence early, this move prepares for rapid central space expansion or a flank attack, often leading to dynamic imbalances. Developing a piece to the center while keeping options open for pawn structure creates a flexible position. Opening a diagonal for the bishop, this fianchetto aims for a kingside blockade. Securing the d5 square with this pawn reinforces black's central presence, preparing for future pawn advances or piece deployment. Solidifying the kingside and preparing for nc3 central pressure. Striking the center, black immediately challenges white's space and opens critical diagonals for their pieces. Expanding the queenside now, white aims to support the central pawns and potentially prepare a fianchetto of the bishop. Establishing the fianchetto allows for dynamic pawn advances later, potentially unlocking central tension. Developing the bishop to its most active diagonal, eyeing the queenside and preparing to castle, offers a flexible setup. Black perfectly develops the bishop to its most natural diagonal, reinforcing the queenside pawn structure and preparing for potential kingside action. Securing the fianchettoed bishop solidifies control over the long diagonal, anticipating further pawn advances. Securing the monarch's safety is paramount, freeing up pieces for more active roles. Bringing the king to safety, castling initiates a period of relative quiet, preparing for central maneuvering. Developing the knight to d7 prepares for potential central pawn breaks and supports the e5 square, creating a solid, yet flexible pawn structure. Preparing to pressure the queenside and potentially break open lines, this move also keeps the queen mobile for future maneuvers. Anchoring the rook to the e-file prepares for central pawn advances and defends against potential knight incursions. Developing the knight further enhances piece activity and prepares to contest central squares, building pressure. The knight retreats to the f8 square, a seemingly passive repositioning, yet it subtly prepares for a potential kingside advance or reinforces the central structure for future maneuvering. Puncturing the center with d4 immediately challenges black's pawn structure and opens lines for white's pieces. Unleashing the bishop, this move seeks to activate a dormant piece and challenge the center's pawns, aiming for dynamic counterplay. Realigning the queen to the c-file prepares pressure and supports a potential d5 pawn push, while also creating flexibility. The knight's journey to e4 creates an intriguing outpost, challenging white's central pawn structure and eyeing the kingside. Asserting control over the d-file is paramount, aiming to disrupt black's fianchetto setup. Recapturing the knight opens the c-file, potentially granting black crucial influence there and disrupting white's pawn structure. By capturing the knight, white opens the b-file, indirectly pressuring black's queenside pawns and creating dynamic possibilities. Unpinning the knight and aiming for greater piece activity, black repositions to contest the central diagonal. Recapturing the pawn opens a diagonal for black's bishop, so white's knight retreats to defend its central structure. Simplifying the structure with this exchange, black aims to activate their rook while preparing for potential pawn breaks in the center. Reclaiming the king from its cozy castled position now opens up the g-file, potentially aiming for a central breakthrough with your pawns. Reorienting the knight towards the queenside offers new possibilities for pawn breaks. Reclaiming the queen's diagonal suddenly ignites tactical possibilities against black's centralized knight. Strategically rerouting the queen to c7 aims to prepare for the e-pawn's advance and bolster the queenside's defense. Repositioning the bishop to b2 aims to bolster the kingside defense and potentially support a future kingside attack, while also regaining some queenside space. Asserting influence on the open c-file, this rook prepares to join the queenside struggle, potentially supporting a pawn push or exchanging defenders. Securing the central c-file with this rook repositioning is a crucial step toward asserting pressure and controlling key squares. Sacrificing the pawn on c4 opens the c-file for white's rook, potentially complicating black's queenside. Reclaiming the center with this capture is essential, opening lines and challenging black's bishop. Shifting the queen to the queenside creates immediate pressure on white's c-pawn and probes for weaknesses in the pawn structure. Reclaiming the central square by bringing the knight to d3 prepares a pawn push to e4, expanding white's control. This pawn thrust injects life into black's cramped position, aiming to disrupt white's central grip and open lines. Opening the d-file decisively, white aims to exploit the unprotected dark squares around black's king. Reclaiming the pawn opens up the long diagonal for black's bishop, creating immediate attacking potential on white's central pawn structure. Pushing the b-pawn aggressively challenges black's advanced queenside pawn structure. This advance aggressively contests the queenside, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and gain active pieces. Liberating the queen from its confined corner allows a dynamic advance, opening lines for potential assaults on black's queenside structure. Exploiting the exposed pawn, black boldly seizes a material advantage and opens lines for counterplay. Recapturing on e5 forces a simplification, opening up new avenues for the rooks to exploit the now weakened central pawns. Recapturing the pawn reopens the knight's diagonal, creating opportunities for queenside pressure. Solidifying king safety, a prudent reaction to the open diagonals. Reclaiming the central files now becomes paramount for black's rooks after that exchange. Establishing dominance over the open c-file solidifies piece activity and prepares for further queenside expansion. A commendable attempt to reactivate the rook, seeking to contest the open c-file and improve its post-capture position. Reinforcing the kingside pawn structure, this prepares to contest the open b-file and develop pieces to more active squares. Entering an endgame with doubled pawns can be tricky, so watch out for open lines. A pivotal moment. The rook's exchange simplifies the position and sets the stage for a pawn race on the queenside. Solidifying the pawn chain, this move aims to prepare for a slow, maneuvering game where black hopes to exploit the isolated d-pawn. A bold pawn thrust aiming to seize vital space on the queenside. This pawn push aims to shatter the queenside structure, creating weaknesses for the opponent's pawns. Sacrificing the rook opens lines and forces a queen trade, potentially simplifying into a winning material advantage. Securing the king on the newly opened file is paramount, as the material imbalance dictates a defensive posture. The rook now commands the open half-file, challenging black's passive pawn structure and preparing a decisive infiltration. Re-establishing the knight's influence on d7 aims to reinforce the queenside pawn structure and prepare for potential counterplay. Fortifying the monarch amidst this simplified yet tense landscape, preparing for potential pawn advances. Recentering the king to a more active square is a critical initiative in this endgame, aiming to leverage its new mobility. Targeting the pinned knight with a decisive check, forcing a positional sacrifice and gaining a material advantage. King venturing out into this dangerous central territory now faces immediate attack and likely further pawn losses. Securing the 7th rank now forces black's pieces into an awkward defensive posture. The king bravely ventures into the open, seeking active participation in this unusual pawn race. Grabbing that pawn initiates a favorable pawn race, aiming to use your past, a pawn for promotion. Recapturing the pawn opens the path for the rook to dominate the 7th rank, creating significant pressure. The bishop's repositioning to a5 aims to exploit the open diagonal and potentially tie down black's rook. Reactivating the bishop's diagonal offers a glimmer of counterplay, but the king remains exposed to the advancing pawns. Securing the king's central position initiates a critical phase, aiming to activate pieces for the looming endgame struggle. Activating the knight to a better outpost on c4 aims to disrupt white's pawn structure. Capturing the pawn opens the a-file, significantly increasing pressure on black's isolated c-pawn and offering white a clear path to victory. Reclaiming the pawn with the king opens up avenues, but it creates a lonely monarch facing enemy activity. Invading the back rank, the rook boldly probes for weaknesses, ready to exploit any disarray in black's position. Claiming the open file with the king opens a dangerous path for your monarch. Initiating a king hunt. This sacrifice aims to expose the opposing monarch and simplify towards a winning material advantage. The black monarch, exposed after pawn advances, now scrambles to find sanctuary amidst the exchanged pieces and open diagonals. Reinforcing the rook's position offers potential support for advancing pawns and pressure along the open files. Activating the rook to its rightful post, this counterplay aims to disrupt white's king's safety. Proactively asserting control of the open central files aims to restrict black's remaining pieces. Centralizing the rook offers immediate activity and a threat to the white king's position. Pushing this pawn opens a path to establish a decisive queenside majority. Shifting the king towards the center offers a better defensive post for the remaining pawns. Securing the rook against further encroachment on the kingside seems a logical step to consolidate gains. The black king scurries to safety, seeking refuge on the 7th rank. Solidifying the kingside presence by advancing this pawn offers increased pawn structure resilience and potential for central dominance. Shifting the king towards the center is a good idea to support the pawn structure and potentially launch a counterattack. Activating the king to centralize and support the pawn advance is key now. Relocating the rook to the open file aims to activate it and challenge white's pawn structure. Asserting dominion over the queenside, this pawn's advance aims to restrict black's pieces and create new avenues for penetration. Attempting to infiltrate the kingside via the b-file seems like a lost cause now that the rook is trapped. Finally activating the rook to threaten the weak pawn and gain control of the open file. Unleashing a king hunt, this check demands white's immediate attention, disrupting their king's safety. Unveiling the king from its sheltered fortress now feels necessary to engage in the final fray. The rook's advance to b6 offers renewed activity, aiming to support the pawn's promotion. This pawn thrust aggressively claims space, potentially cutting off black's rook and forcing further defensive maneuvers. Activating the rook on the queenside initiates a counterplay bid, aiming to disrupt white's dominant pawn. Securing the king is paramount in this simplified board state. Unleashing the pawn on the kingside aims to create new attacking avenues, but it also weakens your own monarch. Consolidating pawns and activating the king for endgame maneuvering. Unleashing pawns for counterplay in this endgame transition seems optimistic given the past a pawn's potential. Unleashing the pawn chain's potential now creates weaknesses in black's pawn structure. Seeking a desperate pawn push to disrupt white's growing space advantage. Unleashing the rook onto the open rank aims to disrupt black's pawns and expose their king's safety. Unleashing a pawn thrust seeks to pry open the kingside and create dynamic play. Solidifying the pawn chain and preparing to advance the king for central control.